3 weeks ago, a fire broke out in one of the buildings here. Firefighters put it out. 6 hours later, in the middle of the night, the same building caught fire again. And this time, the roof caved in before anyone could stop it. That's not the strange part. The strange part is that this place is still open. Right now, today, you can drive 2 exits down Interstate 95, pull off, walk through the legs of a 97-foot fiberglass man in a sombrero, and buy a hot dog. Half of this place is being sold off in pieces. A third of it just burned. And the rest of it is still selling souvenirs to families on their way to the beach, the same way it has for almost 75 years. This is south of the border. It's not abandoned. It's worse than abandoned. It's dying in front of paying customers, one piece at a time, and somehow nobody can agree on whether that's tragic or exactly the point. Every place this channel usually covers has a clean ending. The mine closed, the company left, the town emptied, and what's left is a ruin nobody's touched in decades. South of the border refuses to do that. It's been about to die for years by every visible sign. Crumbling buildings, a casino that closed, an amusement park sold off, a recent fire that took out an entire restaurant, and it just keeps not finishing the job. That makes it a genuinely strange case to study, because most ghost towns and abandoned places get abandoned because the economics simply stopped working. Here, the economics technically still work, just barely, for part of the property, while the rest of it is being peeled away and sold like a body being slowly amputated while the patient keeps walking around. To understand why anyone would let that happen instead of just closing the whole thing down, you have to go back to a beer stand in 1949. In 1949, a businessman named Alan Schaefer owned a beer wholesale company just across the state line in North Carolina. There was a problem. The county he was selling into was legally dry, with alcohol prohibited entirely. So Schaefer did the obvious thing for a man who already knew exactly where the state line was. He built a small, bright pink cinder block beer stand a few hundred yards south, just inside South Carolina, where the rules didn't apply, and named it South of the Border Beer Depot. What turned a beer stand into an empire was timing. In the years after World War II, with gas and travel restrictions finally lifted, American families were taking to the highways in huge numbers, many of them driving the full length of the East Coast toward Florida. Schaefer noticed something. More and more of the traffic stopping at his beer stand wasn't local. It was tourists. So he leaned into it, adding imported Mexican trinkets, then a cocktail lounge, then a gas station, then, by 1954, a full motel. The real turning point came in 1964, when officials announced the new Interstate 95 would run directly past Schaefer's roadside stand, with 2 highway exits positioned right next to it. Schaefer expanded aggressively to meet the opportunity. A barber shop, a drugstore, a post office, a go-kart track, and eventually the now iconic 104-foot fiberglass mascot named Pedro, a grinning, sombrero-topped caricature designed to be visible from the highway long before drivers actually arrived. Within a decade, what had started as a workaround for a dry county had become one of the most recognizable roadside stops in America. Advertised by an almost absurd number of billboards, at its peak, nearly 200 of them, stretched across roughly 500 miles of highway in both directions, each one counting down the miles with a pun. By the 1960s and into the 1980s, south of the border wasn't just a quirky pit stop. It was, for a stretch, a genuine destination, attracting a level of clientele that's hard to picture today looking at the cracked parking lots. Hollywood names like Joan Crawford and Rita Hayworth reportedly stayed overnight at the motel, ordering champagne delivered to a dedicated suite known as the Champagne Room. At its peak, the complex employed roughly 700 people, making it, for a period, the single largest employer in all of Dillon County. Part of what kept the business genuinely profitable for decades was a legal quirk almost identical to the one that started it. Video poker was legal in South Carolina, but illegal in North Carolina. So south of the border built a full casino to capture gamblers from across the state line. The same beer stand loophole logic that founded the place, just run a second time with cards instead of cans. There was also a darker side to the attraction's history worth understanding honestly. Pedro and the attraction's billboards leaned heavily on Mexican stereotypes for decades, with slogans that were, by today's standards and even by some standards at the time, considered offensive. Schaefer's defenders, including his family, have pointed to a more complicated picture. Schaefer was Jewish in a Southern Baptist farming community, routinely employed Black and Latino workers when many businesses around him didn't, helped register black voters, and, according to family accounts, once faced down an armed Ku Klux Klan mob at the property rather than fire his workforce. None of that erases the stereotyping baked into the brand itself. Both things were apparently true at once, which is its own kind of very American contradiction. What's clear is that for a solid 3 decades, south of the border worked. It made money. It employed hundreds of people in a rural county with very few other options. And it became, almost by accident, a genuine landmark of mid-century American road culture. The kind of place that shows up, half joking, half affectionate, in television shows and movies for decades afterward. Alan Schaefer died in 2001, and the attraction passed to his family, who have run it since, currently under his grandson, Ryan Schaefer. And starting sometime after that, the decline that visitors describe today began creeping in, not as one collapse but as a long series of smaller ones. The casino closed as South Carolina tightened its own gambling restrictions, removing the legal loophole advantage that had funded part of the operation for years. The same kind of regulatory shift, ironically, that built the place in the first place, now working in reverse. The amusement park section, known as Pedroland, stopped operating. The convention center fell out of regular use. By 2025, the family made a decision that would have been unthinkable at the attraction's peak. They put roughly 30 acres of the property up for sale, including the entire former amusement park, the convention center building, a motel structure, a mini-golf course, and the shuttered casino, listed for a combined $285 million. What's left operating, for now, includes the Sombrero Observation Tower itself, with its arcade and elevator ride to the top, a reptile lagoon, the main motel and campground, several restaurants, and the famous souvenir shops still selling, by some estimates, millions of individual trinkets a year, 8 kinds of flip-flops, more than 20 kinds of coffee mugs, all branded with Pedro's grinning face. Roughly 300 people still work here today, less than half the workforce at the property's peak, in a county where, according to recent reporting, around 30% of residents live below the poverty line, and south of the border remains one of the only sources of local jobs outside of farming. And then, in late April 2026, the slow decline picked up speed in the most literal way possible. On the night of April 26th, a fire broke out in a restaurant building on the property, a structure that had operated for years under the name Hot Tamale before a recent rebrand to Burrito Loco. Local fire crews from Dillon County, along with a volunteer department from across the state line in North Carolina, arrived and managed to knock the fire down, with what was initially reported as only minor damage. Then, at around 2:30 in the morning, just hours later, the same building caught fire again, this time catching in windy conditions that let it spread far faster than the first blaze. Firefighters spent 4 hours on scene, but the roof ultimately caved in, and the restaurant was declared a total loss. It's a small, almost mundane detail in the scope of a property this size, except for what it represents. A working restaurant, generating revenue, serving customers, reduced to ash within hours, on a property that's simultaneously trying to sell off its own dead weight while keeping the rest of itself alive. Nobody has suggested the fire was anything other than an accident. But the timing lands as an almost too perfect metaphor for what's been happening here for the past 2 decades. Pieces of south of the border keep disappearing, sold, shuttered, or now simply burned, while the core of the place keeps stubbornly, almost defiantly, staying open. So why doesn't the family just sell the whole thing and let it become a flooded reservoir or a forest like everywhere else this channel covers? Part of the answer is straightforward. Parts of south of the border, even now, still make money. The motel, the campground, the souvenir shops, and the fireworks warehouse known as Rocket City, which sells explosives that remain illegal just across the state line in North Carolina, the exact same loophole logic that built this place from a beer stand, apparently still pull in enough traffic from beach-bound families to stay profitable on their own. The other part of the answer is less financial and more stubborn. Multiple members of the Schaefer family have described the attraction, even in interviews acknowledging its visible decline, as something closer to an inheritance than a business. A strange, campy monument to a version of American road culture that mostly doesn't exist anymore, kept alive less because the math demands it, and more because nobody in the family has been willing to be the one who finally lets it go. One local academic who's studied the property for years put it simply: in an era when roadside Americana has mostly been replaced by identical highway exits and chain restaurants, the fact that south of the border is still here, in any form, says something about how much the people running it actually care about its history. There's also the matter of what's around it. Dillon County doesn't have a lot of other economic engines. For a lot of local teenagers and longtime residents, south of the border isn't a nostalgia trip. It's one of the only places nearby to work, or honestly, one of the only places nearby to go. So here's where south of the border actually sits today. A giant fiberglass man in a sombrero still towers over an interstate exit that's carried traffic past him for 60 years. 30 acres around him are for sale in pieces, like a body being sold off, organ by organ while it's still walking around. A restaurant on the property burned to the ground 3 weeks before this video, twice in one night. And every single day, families heading to the beach still pull off the highway, walk through Pedro's Legs, and buy a hot dog like nothing's wrong at all. It's not a ghost town. It's not exactly alive either. It's something stranger than both. A place quietly disappearing in full view of everyone who visits it. One sale, one closure, one fire at a time, with absolutely no one agreeing on when, or if, it actually ends. If a place like this is what you come to this channel for, not fully dead, not fully alive, just slowly disappearing while it's still open, subscribe, because that's exactly the kind of place this channel exists to find next. And if you've ever actually stopped at south of the border yourself, tell me what you saw in the comments. I want to know how much of it was still standing when you got there.